All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking an icon that is so much more than just a building. I mean, you see the Sydney Opera House, and yeah, it's this incredible shape against the harbor. But behind that silhouette is this wild story of genius, of struggle, of political drama, and in the end, a story of triumph. So let's get into it. And hey, don't just take my word for how important this building is. In 2007, UNESCO officially called it a World Heritage Site. We're talking about the same category as the Pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China. It's officially recognized as a work of pure human creative genius. That sets the stage, right? Okay, so before we jump into the incredible story of how it was made, let's just take a second to wrap our heads around the sheer size of this thing. It's basically a giant sculpture. What's so amazing about these numbers is how they ground this beautiful, flowing piece of art in some serious, heavy-duty reality. That highest roof peak, it soars 67 meters into the sky. That's as tall as a 22-story building. And the whole thing is held up by 588 massive concrete piers drilled deep into the harbor floor. And if you want to talk about attention to detail, get a load of this number. That's how many tiles cover those famous shells. Over 1 million of them. They were custom made by a Swedish company, and here's a cool fact, they're actually self-cleaning. The pattern is this subtle mix of glossy white and matte cream tiles that just works. So where did this completely revolutionary idea even come from? Well, it all kicked off back in the 1950s with a really ambitious global competition to design a new performance hall for the nation. And here's where the story gets legendary. Apparently, Jorn Utzon's design, his initial sketches, had been thrown onto a reject pile. But one of the judges, the famous architect Eero Saarinen, pulled it out. He took one look at those radical, sail-like drawings and immediately saw the genius in them. You know, even the judges themselves said Utzon's drawings were, and I quote, simple to the point of being diagrammatic. But they had this incredible foresight. They looked past these simple sketches and saw what it could be. They weren't just picking a building. They knew they were looking at a future landmark that would define a city, maybe even a whole continent. But here's the thing. Utzon's vision was absolutely breathtaking on paper for a reason. Actually turning those drawings into a real, stable structure, well, that was a whole other story. It was a massive engineering puzzle. This was the central problem. It's the question that had the best engineers in the world scratching their heads for years. The first ideas for the shapes were structurally impossible, and the cost to build the molds for each unique curve would have been insane. The project was honestly on the brink of complete failure. Then came the breakthrough. This absolutely elegant, spherical solution. The team had this eureka moment where they realized that every single piece of the roof could be cut from the surface of one giant imaginary sphere. Think of it like peeling an orange. Every piece has the same curve. This meant they could mass-produce the concrete ribs in a common mold. It was genius. And get this, it was one of the very first times computers were used for this kind of complex structural analysis. They were literally inventing the future of architecture as they went. But just as they finally cracked this huge engineering problem, a completely different kind of storm was brewing. This one was political, and it would end up forcing the building's own creator right off the project. And this slide really gets to the heart of the problem. You had two totally different ways of thinking. Utzon saw it as a piece of art that needed to evolve as they discovered new solutions. But the new government, they just saw a project with a budget that was spiraling out of control. It was a classic showdown. Artistic freedom versus political and financial control. Things went downhill fast. The Minister for Public Works, a guy named Davis Hughes, started withholding payments. Utzon literally couldn't pay his staff. So his hand was forced. In February 1966, he resigned from the project he had poured his life into. He left Australia soon after and, tragically, never came back to see his masterpiece finished. Utzon's parting shot, Malice in Blunderland, just perfectly captures the whole situation, doesn't it? It was this absurd mix of bad faith and sheer incompetence that tangled up one of the world's great creative minds in a web of bureaucracy. After Utzon's shocking exit, the project could have just died. But it didn't. Instead, a team of Australian architects, led by a man named Peter Hall, was given the incredibly tough and, let's be honest, pretty thankless job of finishing someone else's magnum opus. So what we see today is really a blend of two different visions. The new team had to make huge changes inside. The main hall, which Utzon wanted for both opera and concerts, became just a concert hall. But the biggest deal was that all of Utzon's revolutionary ideas for the interiors, the acoustics, the seating, everything, were just completely thrown out. And this really shows you the cost of all that complexity and drama. The first estimate was 7 million Australian dollars, supposed to be done by 1963. The final reality, $102 million, finished 10 years late in 1973. That's, wait for it, over 1,300% over budget. Just wild. But thankfully, the story has a more hopeful ending. Utzon wasn't even mentioned at the opening ceremony in 1973, but decades later, in 1999, things started to change. A reconciliation began. They brought him back on as a design consultant, and in 2004, a space called the Utzon Room was opened, the very first interior that was built exactly to his original vision. A little piece of his dream finally realized. And this is really why this all matters. That UNESCO designation in 2007 uses this term outstanding universal value. It means the world officially decided to remember the Opera House not for the controversy, but for what it is. A one-of-a-kind masterpiece, a bold experiment that changed what was possible in architecture, and the symbol of a nation. The whole story of the Sydney Opera House leaves you with this really fascinating question, doesn't it? It was massively over budget, years late, and born from so much conflict. And yet, it became one of the most beloved and recognized buildings on the entire planet. It really makes you wonder, when you're trying to create something that will last forever, what's the real price of genius?